Do you remember when a computer used to just be a box, a boring box that got a job done? Well, those days are kind of gone. More and more these days, we're seeing design and aesthetics take a front row seat when you pick out a system. Well, today, we're featuring a system that takes that up a level. This is the Luna Pro R, a pre-built desktop from PCSpecialist that focuses on looks as well as performance. Let's see if it's any good, shall we? Hi guys, I'm Matt and welcome to Kit Guru and to my full review of this pre-built machine from PCSpecialist. This is the Luna Pro R. To kick things off, as I usually do, the price for this thing is £1,799 and it's part of the new Luna series of PCs from PCSpecialist, as I mentioned. They're all white themed builds and they're configurable with a wide variety of different white parts using the configurator, if you want to call it that, on their website. And all PCS systems come backed with a 3-year warranty as standard, which can be upgraded to like collect and return and that sort of stuff. I'll put some details on the screen now so you can see the different tiers and stuff, but it comes back with a decent warranty. Now, as I just mentioned, all systems from PCSpecialist can be tweaked if you order one. The system that I've got here for review has the following specs. It's got a Corsair 4000D RGB airflow case, obviously in white. It's got a Ryzen 7 7700X CPU, an Asus Prime B650 Plus DDR5 motherboard, 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR5 memory, also in white. It's got a Gigabyte RTX 4070 Aero OC graphics card, again in white, as you can see. And you might notice just below, it's got an up here white GPU support bracket to get all matchy-matchy. It contains a 2TB Solidigm P44 Pro Gen 4 M.2 SSD, a Corsair RMX 850W PSU, which is hidden away behind the shroud at the bottom. It's got a quite chunky deep cool AK500 CPU cooler, obviously again in white. And then it's got white Corsair AF120 fans all around the case. And they've stuck a PCI Express Wi-Fi card in there too. Before we move on to look at each of the components in a bit more detail, let's talk about the design of this build. I think it's stunning, but it's not without its small flaws. The overall theme is obviously white, and straight off the bat, I've got to say that I really like the way it looks. It's clean, it's cable managed well, all of the chosen parts complement each other quite nicely, and it's probably the nicest looking pre-built computer I've ever gotten my hands on. There is one glaring issue though. That GPU power adapter, the high volt power adapter sticking out there like a sore thumb, it stands out from a mile away. Chunky black braided cable coming from the graphics card. It's horrendous. I don't like it at all. But aside from that cable, the build overall, I really like it. It's got RGB by the bucket load thanks to all the Corsair fans. I think the system looks best with the lighting set to static blue rather than this cycling mode that I've got it on here. That static blue just adds to the icy clean aesthetic. So let's look at the parts in a bit more detail, shall we? Starting with the case. Housing the entire build is the Corsair 4000D RGB airflow case in white. A mid-tower chassis that I quite like, to be fair. It's spacious, but not ridiculously massive. It's got decent cable management and routing features, and the build quality and finishing is very good. And I just feel that this case was a pretty solid choice for this build. It looks nice. The CPU is the Ryzen 7700X from AMD, sporting 8 cores and 16 threads with a base clock speed of 4.5 GHz, boosting up to a maximum of 5.4 GHz. We're going to see how that performs later on when we benchmark it. And then moving on to the motherboard, that CPU is sitting in an Asus Prime B650 Plus motherboard. Now, with the white builds, this is the hardest part to nail when going for that white build aesthetic, in my opinion. While this board isn't entirely white, the black and silver styling does fit quite nicely with the rest of the system. It's obviously a DDR5 board. It's got a spare M.2 slot for expanding storage if you need to. It features BIOS flashback, some decent VRM and M.2 heatsinks for when things get a bit toasty. It's a decent choice, and I don't think that there's not too many options they could have gone for to fit with the rest of the build, but it's okay, it does the job. RAM comes in the shape of a 32GB kit of white Corsair Vengeance RGB running at 5,600 megatransfers. Now, admittedly, this isn't the fastest RAM around, but it should do okay during our benchmarks. Stick around till later in the video to see how it performs, but it certainly does look the part and it fits in nicely with the rest of the build. The graphics card is the Gigabyte RTX 4070 Aero OC. It's a pretty massive card for a 4070. It's triple fan and triple slot. It's a thick card. It's got 12 gig of GDDR6 VRAM, and it runs at a core clock speed of 2,565 megahertz. If you want to see a more detailed breakdown and review of the 4070 in general, then check out Dom's video that he did on that. We'll link it down in the description below. Again, white is the theme, and this card stays on that theme and doesn't disappoint. The combination of that white finish and silver backplate work really well together, and then the little splash of blue just adds to that icy feel for the build as a whole that I mentioned earlier. Powering the whole system is a Corsair RMX 850 watt, which is plenty enough juice for the specs, and it'll handle everything easily. It's hidden away nicely behind the Corsair 4000D case's power supply shroud at the bottom. There's not a lot to say here. It's a decent choice of power supply that's out of sight and just does its job. And cooling everything then, the whole system is brought together with the addition of 3 extra white Corsair AF120 case fans. That's on top of the 3 that come included with this case. A PCSpecialist have configured them for front intake and then top rear exhaust, which I can't grumble at. They're all connected via the included Lighting Node core and RGB hub, giving you access to some pretty cool sequential RGB modes within iCUE. Cooling the CPU is the AK500 from Deepcool, not surprisingly also in white. The question could be asked if an AIO or all-in-one cooler would have looked nicer here, which I think it would have. You can configure the Luna system if you want it like that though, but it will bump up the price a little bit. But this cooler should do okay. Again, we're going to look at the thermals later on of the CPU in particular, so we'll be able to see how it's coping with everything. The cable management on the build is great and everything is very tidy back and front. White cable extensions have been used to add to the overall look of the build, which I really appreciate. If only that GPU power adapter could have been white too. So there we have it. That's the nuts and bolts of the Luna Pro R. Now let's look at how this system performs. Onwards to the benchmarks. And I just want to kick things off by saying I've included some comparison data from the most recent pre-built desktop that I reviewed, the Ultra 79 XTX from CyberPower PC. But please bear in mind that the system that I'm comparing this one to costs almost twice as much as the Luna Pro R. So the comparisons are there to highlight the bang for buck you're going to get with this system and how it compares with one of the most expensive systems that we've featured on the channel recently. Kicking things off with Blender then, and we can see that the classroom render test finished in 286 seconds. The CPU handled this test quite well, and it completes the render in a respectable time when compared to the superior 7900X 3D found in the comparison system. And in a Cinebench multi-core run, we see a similar result again, as this is also a CPU-bound test. The 7700X returned a score that is roughly 30% lower than the 7900X 3D. That's not surprising considering the lower core and thread count, but it's still a decent result nonetheless. Moving on to look at Cinebench single-core scores then, and the playing field is levelled quite a bit, with the 7700X coming in just 26 points behind its beefier sibling and recording a score of 1,942 points. This is a promising sign for things to come for the gaming benchmarks we're going to look at in a little bit, particularly in CPU-bound games like Total War or Company of Heroes. 3D Mark Temps by then, and the CPU returned a score of 13,556, which again is a very respectable result for the 7700X when taking the difference in cores and threads into account when compared to that beefier 7900X 3D. A rough 1,250 points difference shows that the 7700X is certainly no slouch. And that gap widens when we move into the GPU results, but this is due to the much more powerful GPU found in the all AMD system. But in the real world, and as we'll see in the benchmarks, the 4070 is more than capable of gaming at high frame rates. Plus it's got some clever NVIDIA tricks up its sleeve like DLSS 3. Moving on to look at memory results then, with a read result of 58,998 megabytes per second, and then a write result of 75,435 megabytes per second. And the write result here pretty much matched the same spec memory found in the comparison system, with a difference of just over 300 megabytes per second. That read result came in a fair bit slower, but is expected from a 7700X based system at roughly 59,000 megabytes. Moving on to the last of our synthetic benchmarks then, PC Mark X, and this system excelled in the content creation section, clocking 15,524 points. But this benchmark is a rough gauge of how a system will perform across a variety of tasks involving both the CPU and the GPU, and these results highlight that the Luna Pro R should be more than capable of carrying out demanding tasks for both work and for gaming. Speaking of gaming, let's move into the gaming benchmarks, which I'll run through quickly. I tested 10 games, and then at the end, I'll give you the 10 game average at 1440p and 4K. Kicking things off with Hogwarts Legacy then, and we can see the 1440p result was quite respectable, recording an average FPS of 73.5. 4K did drop quite drastically though, but that is an indication of the 4070. It's not really a 4K card. Moving into Cyberpunk 2077, we saw a similar story with the average FPS at 1440p at 92.4 and it bombing down to a similar sort of level of Hogwarts at 37.6 average. Moving into Company of Heroes 3, at 1440p we saw an average FPS of 108, with that dropping down to 56.9 when switching over to 4K. And moving into Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 then, which was quite an impressive result. At 1440p we saw 102.3 average FPS, and it still managed to maintain above 60 average at 4K. That's pretty good. Shadow of the Tomb Raider then, at 1440p, we got a massive 153.7 average FPS, and then that average at 4K was still impressive at 80.1. Battlefield 2042, a kind of similar-ish result to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with 120 average FPS at 1440p and still hitting above 60 at 4K. Assassin's Creed Valhalla then, which can be quite demanding in certain situations, but at 1440p we saw a pretty respectable 116.7 average FPS, while again at 4K it manages to keep that average above 60, clocking 69.6. And moving into F1 2022 at 1440p saw a 92.3 average FPS, but that 4K performance did dip below 60, recording 46.7 average. So The Witcher 3 then, and we saw an average FPS of 66.3 when gaming at 1440p, and bumping that resolution up to 4K saw the frame rate drop down to 37.9 average. This is at Ultra Plus settings though, so you could lower those down a little bit if you wanted to increase the frames you were getting. Total War Warhammer 3 then at 1440p, recording an average FPS of 88.8, but that's dipped down to 46.9 at 4K, so we saw sub 60 FPS performance at 4K getting this title. And to round out the benchmarking and give a more overall picture of the performance of this computer, we look at the 10 game average FPS, which at 1440p came in at 101.4 on the average and 74.5 at that 1% low. And then at 4K, we can see that the average FPS was 54.1 with the 1% low at 41.2. So that is still quite respectable gaming at 4K, even on this 4070. And as I said during The Witcher, you could bump the settings down a little bit, which could increase frame rates. But overall, these are respectable results. Finally, for our testing then, we're going to look at the thermals, the noise and the power. The CPU was pushed to its limit during the Cinebench multi-core test, hitting 95 degrees, which is the maximum safe operating temperature of the 7700X. The result during Cyberpunk was more respectable though, peaking at 76 degrees during a sustained test at max settings. Idle saw the CPU temperature sitting around 47 degrees with an ambient room temperature of 22 degrees. Ryzen chips tend to run quite hot, so this result didn't surprise me, and it's about right. And GPU temperatures then, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, the Gigabyte Aero OC model of the RTX 4070 found inside the Luna Pro R is quite hefty. It's a triple fan card, and that substantial cooling can be seen in the results from my testing. The GPU peaked at 54 degrees during a 30-minute sustained test in Cyberpunk 2077. The memory reading was only very slightly higher at 56 degrees, while that hotspot temperature peaked at 64 degrees. These are very respectable results, considering how demanding Cyberpunk can be. And what's more, this was at maximum settings, so it was pushing the card quite hard. And noise levels coming from this computer, and I've got to say, while I was testing it, I did notice that the system was quite noisy, even before I tested it with my audio meter. The fans and the cooler do sound off quite a lot when they ramp up. At idle, the system generated 46.1 decibels of noise, with that ramping up all the way to 56.4 decibels when running a Cinebench benchmark. I haven't changed anything at all related to the fan curves on this computer, so the noise generated by the system could be optimized by applying a custom fan curve if you wanted it to run a little bit quieter. Here's a few quick clips of the sound that I measured during the different tests. So finally, we'll move on to look at the power usage. The CPU package power peaked at 127 watts during a 10-minute Cinebench test, with that figure dropping back to 89 watts during Cyberpunk 2077 and 35 watts when the system was idle. And then to finish off the benchmarking then, I measured the total system power draw directly from the wall socket using a power meter to give a bit more of a real world measurement, and then compared it to the all AMD system that we were looking at alongside this earlier. Cyberpunk, using both the CPU and the GPU, saw the system pulling down 328 watts, almost 200 less when compared to the higher end parts in the comparison system. Cinebench and idle power usage were both comparable, coming in at 235 and 107 watts respectively. So just to talk about the cost and the build your own versus pre-built thing, which I know many people are going to say in the comments, as this is a white build and a pre-built, I instantly wanted to know how much of a difference that's going to make to the price when compared to building it yourself using boring old non-white parts. So I priced it up as close as I could to the same build on PC Part Picker with all the merchants active, and I was pretty surprised. The system that I spec'd up came in at £1,669.31p. And as a reminder, this system costs £1,799. And the system that I spec'd up didn't include a Windows license, which will cost you a little bit on top of that £1,669. Then factor in that although you do get manufacturer's warranty on the parts that you order and build yourself, using any of those warranties, especially having multiple parts go at the same time, is going to be a bit more painful than having a warranty that covers the system as a whole, as is the case with the one that's on offer from PCSpecialist. I just can't complain about that pricing. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive than building your own, but if you don't have time, you're new to PC gaming and don't feel comfortable building, or just simply don't want the hassle, then the premium charged for PCSpecialist for this PC being delivered to you, ready to go, is, I feel, very, very reasonable. In conclusion then, I really like this PC. I've always toyed with the idea of going with a white build, and checking this thing out and getting hands on time with a white build myself has pushed me down that route of making that decision. I'm going to go with a white build next time I upgrade. But coming back to talk about this PC, you can definitely tell that PC Specialist had design at the forefront of their minds with this, and when they came up with that whole new Luna lineup and configurator. With this one specifically though, the cable management was top notch, is top notch, and it really helps the build to look as clean as possible. It's little touches like that that bring everything together, like the cable extensions and that sort of stuff, just make it all look that bit nicer. The performance is pretty good for the price, and it will easily handle gaming at 1440p. If you're looking for a 4K gaming machine, then you'll probably need to dig a bit deeper into your pockets. It will do it, but you might want a bit better performance, but that's not what this computer is designed to do. The pricing is very good, and the peace of mind from the warranty is worth the extra cost, in my opinion. I'd like to have seen 6,000 mega transfers memory used though, which would have pushed the performance up a little bit, as Ryzen CPUs really like fast memory. And that 12 volt power adapter, the high volt power adapter on the GPU here, definitely needs to be white, as it stands out. Well, it stands out like a massive black cable in the middle of a white PC. But all in all, this is a decent gaming PC for the money that'll handle gaming with ease and looks great in a white setup. PC Specialist have made me want a white PC. My wallet is not going to thank them, and this one is a decent option. And that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like down below if you did. Subscribe to KitGuru to keep up with the latest PC gaming news and reviews. If you want to visit our website, join our Discord server, or visit our Patreon page, you'll find links to all that stuff in the video's description. There's a merch section just below this video if you want to get a hoodie or a t-shirt or a cup or whatever. Anyway, guys, I've been Matt. This has been the Luna Pro R from PC Specialist. I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.